In 1919, a 17-year-old walked into the offices of the Kansas City Star newspaper. He wanted to be a cartoonist. The editor looked at his drawings and fired him on the spot. And the reason, the exact reason, was this: he lacked imagination. He had no good ideas. That boy was Walt Disney. Today, the company that carries his name is worth more than $200 billion. It owns Pixar. It owns Marvel. It owns Star Wars. It owns half of your childhood. But most people only know the ending. The parks, the princesses, the empire. What almost nobody remembers is that Walt Disney spent the first 15 years of his career broke. He filed for bankruptcy. He lost his most famous character to a contract trick. He mortgaged his house to build Disneyland. And he almost lost everything 3 separate times before he got there. Let's start with the story. He was born in 1901 in Chicago, the fourth of 5 children. His father, Elias, was a failed farmer who tried everything: orchards, deliveries, odd jobs, and succeeded at almost nothing. Walt delivered newspapers at 4 in the morning from the age of 9. He didn't finish high school. What he had always had, was a pencil. At 17, he came back from driving ambulances in France at the end of World War I. He was broke, confused, and certain of one thing: he was going to draw cartoons for a living. So he went to the Kansas City Star, and they fired him. The editor's words entered legend. He lacked imagination. He had no good ideas. It is, to this day, the most famous firing in American business history, because the man they threw out would go on to redefine what imagination was worth. But first, he failed. Hard. In 1921, at 20 years old, he started a company called Laugh-O-Gram Studio. He convinced investors to back him. He hired animators. He made short animated films based on fairy tales. And within 2 years, he was bankrupt. Not running low on money, bankrupt. Literally eating cold beans out of a can kind of bankrupt. He slept in his studio. He took baths at the train station. By the summer of 1923, he had exactly $40 to his name and a one-way train ticket to Hollywood. He arrived in California carrying 1 suitcase and the rights to a single unfinished short film called Alice's Wonderland. That was the entire inventory of the man who would one day build Disney. 4 years later, things looked different. He had joined forces with his older brother Roy, the business brain to Walt's creative one, and together they had created a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was a hit. The shorts were making real money. Walt was 26 and finally stable. Then, in 1928, he took the train to New York to negotiate a bigger contract with his distributor, a man named Charles Mintz. And Mintz looked him in the eye across a table and calmly told him 2 things. First, that he had quietly hired away most of Walt's animators behind his back. Second, and this one sliced deeper, Walt didn't actually own Oswald. Universal did. Walt had signed a contract 3 years earlier without reading the fine print. The character, the merchandise, the film rights, all gone in a single afternoon. He got back on the train to California, quiet, humiliated, and somewhere in the middle of that 3-day journey, the legend goes, he began sketching a new character on a napkin, a mouse. He called him Mortimer. His wife, Lillian, told him Mortimer was a terrible name. She suggested Mickey. Mickey Mouse made his screen debut 8 months later. This time, Walt owned every single scrap of him. Most people aren't building empires. They're just trying not to lose a decade to the same small mistake, making short-term decisions about long-term problems. They treat their finances like weather, something that happens to them instead of a system they can build. The financial restart system was designed to break that exact pattern, a framework for rethinking how you handle money from the ground up, without shortcuts and without fantasies. It's the kind of structure most people wished they had been handed at 25, instead of learning it the hard way at 40. If that sounds like something you need, the link is in the description. Back to Walt. By 1934, he had an idea that every studio executive in Hollywood thought was suicidal. He was going to make a feature-length animated film, 90 minutes, full color, based on a fairy tale about a princess and 7 dwarves. Nobody had ever done that. Nobody had ever tried. Animated shorts were 7 minutes. That was the industry ceiling. When Walt announced the budget, $1.5 million, the Hollywood press started calling the project, openly, Disney's folly. They said audiences wouldn't sit through 90 minutes of drawings. They said the budget was madness. The average Hollywood film of that era cost $250,000. Walt mortgaged his house. Production ran 3 years over schedule, and the final budget landed near that same $1.5 million, 6 times what anyone else in Hollywood was spending on a complete film. And this one wasn't even live action. Snow White premiered in December of 1937. It made $8 million in its first run. Adjusted for today, it is still one of the highest-grossing films ever released. The Folly built an entire studio. But Walt Disney was not a saint. And this is where most biographies start whispering. In 1941, his own animators went on strike. They wanted higher wages. They wanted screen credit. They wanted union protection. Walt took it as a personal betrayal. He believed his studio was a family, and family didn't strike. The conflict turned ugly. It lasted 5 weeks. He never forgave the organizers. He fired the ringleaders. He kept lists of grudges for decades. In 1947, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named strike leaders as communists. That testimony ended careers. It is one of the reasons his name still comes up, uncomfortably, in conversations about the Hollywood blacklist. There were other shadows. Arguments about his private politics. Rumors about his relationship with the Union until the day he died. And one especially persistent myth, that his body was frozen after his death to be revived someday in the future. Completely false. He was cremated in December of 1966. Walt Disney was not a simple man. He was brilliant, obsessive, controlling, generous to his friends and lethal to his enemies. Which brings us to the thing nobody thought he could build. By the early 1950s, Walt wanted an amusement park. A clean one. A family park. Unlike the dirty and dangerous carnival parks of that era. Every bank in America turned him down. Every single one. They told him amusement parks were a dying industry. They told him he was a cartoonist, not a developer. They told him the numbers didn't work. So he did something nobody expected. He borrowed against his personal life insurance policy. He sold his vacation home. He convinced Roy to pour the studio's reserve cash into it. And then, in the deal that would change American entertainment forever, he went to ABC. ABC was a struggling third-place television network in 1954. They desperately needed content. Walt desperately needed cash. He offered them a weekly television show called Disneyland, a program that would both entertain America and advertise the future park every Sunday night for free. In exchange, ABC put up $500,000 and took a 34% ownership stake in the park itself. The park opened on July 17, 1955, and it was a disaster. Rides broke, food ran out, drinking fountains didn't work. Counterfeit tickets let in 28,000 people on a day designed for 10,000. The press called it Black Sunday. 6 months later, Disneyland was the most profitable park in American history. He didn't stop there. In the early 1960s, Walt realized Disneyland had one fatal flaw. He had not bought enough land around it. Within a year of opening, hotels and imitation attractions and tourist traps had surrounded Anaheim. Other people were getting rich off his traffic. He was not going to make that same mistake twice. So he went to Florida, quietly. He created a web of shell companies with innocent-sounding names like Latin American Development Corporation and Reedy Creek Ranch Incorporated, specifically to hide his identity. Over 2 years, he secretly bought 27,000 acres of swampland in central Florida, roughly twice the size of Manhattan, at an average price of around $200 per acre. If the sellers had known it was Disney, the price would have been 100 times higher. He never saw Disney World open. He died in December of 1966, at 65 years old, of lung cancer. He had been a heavy smoker most of his life. The very last project he worked on, from his hospital bed, was sketching plans for a future prototype city he called Epcot. He drew it on the ceiling tiles above his bed, pointing out sections of the design to his brother Roy the night before he died. Walt Disney's entire career was one long argument with the word no. No. He couldn't be a cartoonist. No, he couldn't make a feature film. No, he couldn't build a theme park. No, he couldn't change the entertainment industry. He was told he had no imagination. He was fired for it. He went bankrupt. He had his most famous character stolen. He testified in one of the ugliest congressional hearings of the 20th century. He died before seeing most of what he is now remembered for. But that editor in Kansas City got one thing exactly backwards. The problem was never that Walt Disney had no imagination. The problem was that everyone else had too little.